Also long-standing issues that are often called the root causes of immigration. We are looking at the issue of poverty and the lack, therefore, of economic opportunities, the issue of extreme weather conditions and the lack of climate adaptation, as well as corruption and the lack of good governance, and violence against women, indigenous people, LGBTQ people, and Afro-descendants.
You can't explain away Latin history and Latin culture and say that everything that happens in Latin America is America's doing. There is such a thing as Guatemala. There is a country. There is a people. The fact that we've had a democracy since 1789 and they haven't is not because we imposed military dictatorship on them.
Billion presidents have sometimes come and always gone. Guatemala was effectively ruled by the most ruthless and efficient army in Latin America.
Izquierda!
And in the 1950s and 60s, that army and its ferocious intelligence branch was created, armed and trained in counterinsurgency doctrine by the freedom-loving agents of the USA.
The United States created the killing machine that went on to murder and torture hundreds of thousands of people. And perhaps most importantly, the United States poured millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars into training. They trained the Guatemalan military how to raid houses. They trained them in surveillance. They trained them in interrogation techniques. And we have now, years later, the declassified CIA and Defense Department manuals to prove it. I have something from, for example, as early as 1954, which is called A Study of Assassination. And it describes in the most chilling and bureaucratic terms how to murder an individual or individuals. It even goes on to show in graphic terms how to enter a room with 10 people sitting around a table and murder them one by one. So these documents give us a very rare glimpse into the inner workings of a counterinsurgency strategy and tactics that we were very much on the ground helping to design.
All right, that feeling when you've had a democracy since 1789. Welcome to Left Reckoning, everyone. I'm Matt Leck, with me, David Griscom. David, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, brother, man. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. Kamala Harris had some things to the Guatemalan president.
Yeah, it's definitely something that there's a lot to touch on here, which is why we decided to make our whole opening segment about it. And we'll get to that in just a second, but just for folks who are joining us just now, we'll be joined in a little bit by comrade and friend Ben Burgis to talk about his new book, Canceling Comedians While the World Burns. And after that, actually before that, we'll be playing a little preview of a conversation that we'll be releasing this Sunday with Milton Alamati about the radical legacy and thought of Walter Rodney. So definitely stick around for this. But yeah, we have to touch on this Kamala Harris thing, because while everyone is sort of distracted and focusing on Biden's speech last night, it's not something that's particularly exciting for me to really take a deep dive into. But Kamala Harris's conversation with the Guatemalan government earlier this week really hits at a few different things: imperialism, a kind of liberal way of talking about the world's problems, a kind of way where you think if you name enough buzzwords that the actual structural reality of crises goes away. Actually, do we have that clip right now handy, Matt? I know we played it at the beginning, but for folks who are seeing this as a clip later, it's really worth watching again. This is Kamala Harris, who's talking to the president of Guatemala. The reason for this is because there is a humanitarian crisis at the U.S. border. Kamala Harris has now very notably refused to go and visit these detention facilities, as we are getting more and more reports that the conditions have not really improved there from the Trump administration. She's not going to the crisis point. As the vice president of the United States, again, this is the task force that she has been put in charge of. They've made a big deal about how Kamala Harris is not just going to be a symbolic vice president, but is going to be very, very active in the United States, in U.S. policy. And this is her first major appointment. And she still has not come to Texas to see these facilities, which, as we've covered many times on this show, and most of you all are familiar with, are disaster zones. They are inhumane. The treatment is abhorrent, and there is a lot more that could be being done today, and they're still not doing it. Kamala Harris instead has said that she wanted to study the root causes of the migration and brought that up in a discussion with the president of Guatemala earlier this week.
There are also long-standing issues that are often called the root causes of immigration.
I just love the language, like long-standing issues, like just euphemisms that really just pad things out that don't really mean anything.
Yeah.
Oops, sorry, I lost my mouse here. There we go.
The root causes of immigration. We are looking at the issue of poverty and the lack, therefore, of economic opportunities, the issue of extreme weather conditions and the lack of climate adaptation, as well as corruption and the lack of good governance, and violence against women, indigenous people, LGBTQ people, and Afro-descendants.
Yeah. Let's just take the first reaction because it's the right reaction. It takes a lot of gall to sit as the vice president of U.S. empire and to talk to people about anti-Black violence, anti-indigenous violence, anti-LGBTQ violence, anti-women violence. It's exceptional and it's wrong. Not because the president of Guatemala is some kind of left-wing hero or anything like that, by the way, but because this is a country that has been bent to the will of U.S. empire for decades to extreme devastation of the people who live there. So to act about these things like there's just these kind of questions of some abstract bigotry, for example, that just, invaded the population of Guatemala is absurd and it's despicable.
Yeah, right. It centers it in the people as if it's their sort of homophobia and misogyny and anti-indigenous sort of feelings latent in the people themselves, and not as if like that stuff has been juiced for purposes of a political project to avoid like land reform.
Yeah, exactly. Well, to avoid land reform or any kind of alternative to capitalism. And like it was very notable, and a lot of people make the point, it's like she doesn't mention capitalism except in the absence, right? Except in like, poverty. And then, she doesn't mention imperialism, right? And a lot of folks have gone over the history of the United States coup, the U.S.-backed coup in Guatemala in the 1950s. Again, not even against the president who was some kind of radical lefty by any stretch of the imagination, but just somebody who wasn't wanting to toe an exact U.S. line. We then decided that we need to implement military dictatorship. And as Matt put in the opening sequence for this show, we're training the military there on how to do mass murder events. I mean, some of the most evil anti-human stuff you can imagine.
Yeah, mass graves like still being uncovered to this day. It's like a industry down there.
Yeah,
and then just lying about it. Like the State Department would just lie, saying, we've actually done our research. It's hard to know. Like Elliot Abrams hand waves, like it's hard to know. You only trust your sources. But we guess that on balance, it's probably the rebels who have been doing most of the violence. And actually, when they've done studies, just finding like bodies in mass graves with like 3 bullet holes in the back of the head. That the violence, 99% of which, this shouldn't be a shock to anybody familiar with like Vincent Bevan's Jakarta method, right? Is from the of the anti-communist and the anti-indigenous, like just genocide folks.
No, exactly. And so there's so much history to talk about, but I wanted to take, this little brief amount of time that we have to talk about what's happening today, because this is a rhetorical strategy that we see, particularly from liberals, to use kind of like big buzzwords like racism or like anti-indigenous violence, anti-LGBTQ violence, to distract from what's actually happening on the ground. It's not, by the way, don't misunderstand me, that there isn't mass programs of anti-indigenous violence, mass programs of racist violence, mass programs of anti-LGBTQ and violence against women, right? It's that you use these words to sort of abstract from the forces that are creating these in the first place. So we'll get to that in just a second. First, I wanted to read from this piece. You could pull that up real quick, Matt, at NACLA.org. That sort of goes through what the Biden administration response to this humanitarian crisis has been so far. Meanwhile, harsh U.S. immigration policies continue to dehumanize and criminalize migrant children and families at the United States-Mexico border. Biden has continued to pressure Mexico and Guatemala to repress Central American migrants and caravans. And on April 12th, his administration reached an agreement to have these countries increase military presence at their borders. Despite promising to end family detention, Biden continues to imprison children and families in inhumane conditions. The United States also continues to support corrupt Central American presidents, such as Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez, right, who has been implicated in narco trafficking. This is what the Biden administration is doing in response to this humanitarian crisis, right? It's continuing to pressure governments there to use the most repressive aspects of the state, right? The police and the military, to harass people, to intimidate people, to hurt people, and then to continue the terror that we are seeing in the U.S. today at the border, right? I just wanted to bring that up when you hear Kamala talk about, failure of government in Guatemala or violence in Guatemala, that we're participating in those systems, right? But I really wanted to focus on a couple of things. We hear about the need to defend Native peoples in the U.S., like in rhetoric, right? In Kamala's rhetoric. But what happens today in this country when the Apache are fighting to ensure that copper mines are not built on their lands through a process that will not only make their land inaccessible to them, but will sink the land around it, turning one of their most holy sites into a man-made crater to greed, right? So we hear all this talk about what's happening in Guatemala and anti-indigenous violence, but yet these systems are continuing in the United States today. And obviously there is no irony to talk about anti-Black violence, to come out of country to talk about anti-Black violence when we just saw a nationwide uprising to make sure that a murder of a Black man that was captured on video would not end in the acquittal of the murderer, right? But again, these things, we can do this with any kind of criticism the United States makes about other countries, because we do not have a perfect record when it comes to humanitarian issues, right? But let's talk really about what's going on in Guatemala and the U.S. relationship there. She promises here that there's going to be an increase in investment so that they can get to the root causes of the crisis. I wanted to mention that this term root causes is not unique to Kamala Harris, even though it might seem like it's some kind of like new development in ways of speaking liberal discourse. This goes back all the way to I'm sure it goes back much deeper, but in recent memory, this goes back 2014, when Joe Biden is put in charge, who was vice president then, of the Alliance for Prosperity, which was
sounds fun.
A very fun alliance that helped a lot of great people, right? No, it was another one of these schemes where the U.S. government says we need to fight against systemic racism and anti-indigenous violence in Central America to stop these migrations, right? And what happens? The United States talks a big game about, all of these structural issues, and then funds the police and the military. And then their investment to fight poverty essentially just lines the pockets of an already wealthy national bourgeoisie and is used to push forward another round of privatization, notably free markets, right? Pushing for free market neoliberalization. The history in these countries, particularly in Guatemala, but in Nicaragua and in Honduras, right, is the democratic transition from U.S.-backed military regimes was predicated on neoliberal reforms, free trade, and utter suppression of the working class. And it created state models that were highly unequal and highly dependent on the United States. And that's something that has to be noted. So when you hear the United States is increasing their aid to countries, that's not necessarily meaning that things are getting better. These systems have been designed so that these countries are dependent on the United States for funding because the United States has pursued uneven development in those countries. As Michael Parenti famously said, there are not rich countries and poor countries. There are rich people and poor people. The United States is not interested in Guatemala because it is poor, but because it is rich. It is the national bourgeoisie and international capitalist class who are getting rich from pillaging the land in Guatemala. And when it comes to migration, when you extract all the capital from a country and it flows into the United States, when you push for free trade agreements, which means the resources and the money is all coming to the United States, of course you're going to get a flow of people, not because they want to leave their homes, but because it's difficult for them to maintain, a basic standard of living there. Talking about the root causes in Guatemala, in 2014, Obama again, spent all this money doing security training for Guatemala. And then what did much of the aid go to? It went to lining the pockets of wealthy bourgeoisie. It went to pushing for more and more privatization in these countries. And it also went to the expansion of the detention facilities that we note and rightfully critique Donald Trump on, right? Along with this push for free trade. But in the very last bit, I just wanted to focus on one thing that Kamala was talking about, which was anti-indigenous violence in Guatemala, because that is very serious and people lose their lives every day and people are fleeing terror in that country. And what's so frustrating about the way that Kamala Harris is talking about what's happening there is not just, the irony of her lecturing a Guatemalan president on these issues, but the fact that she ignores the reason for these conflicts, the reason for these deaths, right? Maya people in Guatemala are brutally murdered and they face state terror and police violence. They face violence that is spurned and that is encouraged by US-backed transnational corporations that are doing what in the traditional lands of the Maya people there? They are trying to control the land for the production of palm oil. For folks who understand, that crop takes up a lot of space. It's extremely damaging, but it's also very profitable. Maya people are being murdered in their homes at the behest of people who are profiting from the palm oil industry. That is the engine that is what greases the wheels of the engine of death and destruction in that part of the world, right? It's the pursuit of profit for a few international capitalists to exploit and devastate the Maya people who have been fighting for their lands for centuries. This is not the first chapter in this fight, but this is what's happening. So when Kamala is, trying to talk about, the suffering of folks, right? We should challenge her to take her words seriously if she thinks this is a crisis and to start targeting the actual organizations that are behind this violence instead of just abstracting them away. So it's something that's immaterial and something that's deep in people's souls instead of something that is in people's bank accounts. And if they want to be serious about changing this dynamic, that's the kind of rhetoric and change that we would need to see.
Yeah, it's interesting that structural root causes is a lot like how Democrats are comfortable saying structural racism now. Yeah, and it's like, what's that structure? Is it just the government you're talking about, or is it like the system of corporate capitalism to control all of like our material lives? Is that maybe what we want to address? And no, it's really what the insidious part of the messaging is that the problem we always say, or at least I keep peddling on about, which is like they're managers, they're not Democrats really, and they're more comfortable with that as a posture. So it's
because it's like it's a spiritual force.
Yes, yeah, exactly, and doesn't really challenge the setup of our relationship with Guatemala, for instance.
No, exactly. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about this with Ben because there's actually a lot more to dive into there. But before we hop to Ben, I did want to, encourage people who haven't already to consider supporting this work on patreon.com/leftreckoning. But I also wanted to preview a conversation that we're going to be having with our great friend, teacher, and comrade Milton Alamati about the legacy of Walter Rodney, who is an incredible historian and socialist and fighter who was taken from us way too soon. And I'm excited for this conversation, one, because it's going to highlight a very important, historical figure, but also because it's this kind of analysis that you get from Walter Rodney, where you don't get caught up in these kind of like buzzwords, but actually start looking at the material relations here. So there's so much from this, and I tweeted it out from this conversation, this speech that Walter Rodney, that you can find on YouTube of Walter Rodney's. But I wanted to highlight this just shorter, like minute and a half clip, just give people a little bit of taste of who he was and why this analysis is so important. And hopefully y'all will join us on Sunday to hear more of that conversation.
To do a lot of chewing. Now in that framework, of course, one is thinking about the possibilities of social change. The analysis of what is happening is only intended to be the first step in an analysis or a program, or at least some sense of direction of where changes are possible. And what I'm going to emphasize briefly in that respect is the question of who makes the changes rather than what changes are made. Because I think we have in part been trapped by the question of what changes should be made. And if I were to make a self-criticism, I would say that I too might have been trapped by that vision. In the sense that in the past, if you made this critique, someone will come to you and say, well, tell us what you would do. Tell us what the economy should look like. What is the proper development plan for Guyana or Barbados or Ivory Coast, as the case might be? And there you go, knocking your brains trying to devise a program of development. But of course, this program of development has to be implemented by somebody, by someone, by some social group. It surely cannot and will not, for the very reasons implicit in this analysis, it cannot be developed by the present state systems, by the classes that presently control that state. And therefore it seems to me that we have to shift from that, although we need to look at it in a technical sense ultimately, and to be far more rational and scientific in planning, we need to concentrate more on who will do the changes, who has the right to reassess the situation. And in this context, I will fall back on a social class analysis, because it seems to me that that is the only valid way that we can understand how the societies are functioning and which groups can make a contribution.
Yeah, I mean, I'm telling y'all that whole conversation is so rich. I almost feel bad having to cut him off there, because he goes into a pretty good rant about how that will not be the petty bourgeoisie, which he includes himself in, by the way, for folks who get confused about that. He does say that we have individual choices, but you have to remember that you need to be asking these questions as a Marxist, like who is making the changes and for what. Anyways, Walter Rodney is an incredible thinker. I'm looking forward to talking to Milton soon.
That's going to be great. It's always good to talk to Milton. So we have Ben. We'll be right back, folks. And we're going to take a quick break, but back in a minute with Ben Burgis, talk about a lot of things, actually. Talk about a little bit of Cuba, and also, of course, his book, Canceling Comedians While the World Burns. Be back in a second. Welcome back, folks. Joining us now, host of Give Them an Argument. Ben, I should know, I thought I had your all your different titles in my head, and I'm realizing now that I don't. But for the sake of this podcast, you can fill in the other ones I don't mention. But Give Them an Argument, the show. People should go if they're not familiar with, they should familiarize themselves with. And also author of Give Them an Argument, the book, and most recently Canceling Comedians While the World Burns. And then what's the subtitle do we got, Ben?
Critique of Contemporary Left.
Yes, and which I read on Wednesday evening. I think you did a great job of putting things into proportion. It struck me as sort of like part 2 of Give Them an Argument. Like it's like like seriously, guys, give them an argument. And there, I will just say up front that there are certain parts of the cancel culture debate where I am sympathetic to maybe a Nathan Robinson approach to it. But the title of the book I think is well chosen because it's something that I've literally gone through this exact thing. On Majority Report, I asked a bunch of people several years ago, to the point where it became mild, like a minor thing where people had to like IM and stuff and call in about for a couple of days. That I said, I don't think whether Louis C.K. plays a Kansas City comedy club is something we should really devote a whole bunch of our time on. And people really got upset at me towards that. So. With all that said, talk about what you're emphasizing with this book and why you think it's important. Because I do think, like, look, I am a person that has a little less patience with certain arguments in this genre, but I think you've put it proportionally very well.
Appreciate that. So yeah, I guess the other things I'd add to, I guess really the only other thing I'd add to the bio is Jacobin columnist, because I'm always telling people that like if I get hit by a truck or something tomorrow, like what I want on my tombstone is Ben Burgis, loving husband, son, brother, was on the masthead at Jacobin. So
very well, yes.
But yeah, so I like what you said about how it was kind of a sequel to the first book, because in fact, I actually find this kind of funny that like I think some people who aren't crazy about the fact that I did the second book like seem to see some sort of like change there. And I mean, do you read the first one? Because like I said all this stuff, I just like it wasn't the emphasis, but I did say all of it. And this is the second book is an attempt to sort of do a deeper dive on the stuff I kind of say, to set up the first book. And I'm very concerned in both cases about a set of behaviors, a set of attitudes, ways of doing things that I think undermine the left's effectiveness. So I'm, with your example about Louis C.K. The point isn't, and I think I get where this comes from, because I think this is some of what's animating that. Nathan Robinson kind of perspective that that you mentioned. Like, okay, well, hold on. We live in a world where imperialist wars exist, police violence exists, poverty wages exist, and so if your reason for not liking people act in this way is that you're concerned, for Louis C.K., that always is Louis going to be okay, then I get it, right? I get the sort of pushback against that. My concern is different. I think that it's not that I don't think that there are any harms that ever come from this stuff. I think there are. I mean, we talked about that a little bit last time I was on the show, and I do think there is kind of a performative contradiction sometimes in the attitudes of people who in lots of other contexts think that psychological harms are very real harms. But in just this one, right? They say, oh, whatever, log off, you'll be fine. But I agree that, like, as far as harms go, I mean, these are very far down the list. My concern instead is with making the left look like overgrown hall monitors in a way that makes us vastly less appealing to most of the people that we need to win over.
Yes, and that's what I like, as I think it's the posture that's the most off-putting. Like, irrespective of the content of any one of these fights, really, that people might come down on a separate side of, it's just not a good, like, because I'm somebody who likes, like, Joe Rogan is a great example that always comes up, right? Like, and I have cousins who like are Joe Rogan guys, and if I was just like telling him, hey, don't watch that, it's gonna like make you bad or something like that, I just know like that's gonna reflect on me, even though I'm their cousin. Like, that's just not what people respond well to. Whereas like if you can actually like you say, I guess, give the argument that is something to latch onto that's real, so they don't feel like they're being managed, basically.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And the Rogan case, I think, is a really telling one because because Rogan obviously is all over the place. He says things that he said things that I loved. In most cases, the reason I know he said them is that there were Majority Report clips about them, and he's said things that I've absolutely hated. Including some very recent things, but ultimately, he's a little all over the place. He doesn't really have a coherent political perspective. But guess what? Neither do your neighbors, neither do, well, not you guys, but, your, in the larger sense, your coworkers, neither do most people, because most people aren't weird political obsessives like us. Most people have political instincts, they have political reactions to things, but they haven't really thought about it enough for those to cohere into an internally consistent worldview. I think it's the same with Rogan. I mean, that like sure, he spent 10,000 hours interviewing political guests because he's been on the air for 1 million hours, but like it's nothing compared to the number of martial artists and drug gurus and comedians and actors, that he's interviewed. And ultimately, he's more interested in, psychedelics and conspiracy theories and mixed martial arts and 1,000 other subjects that he is in politics. But what bothers me is the fixation on, is Joe Rogan a good person or a bad person, which always reminds me of that Adolf Reed line about how this is just too Protestant a way of approaching politics. It's all about who's going to heaven and who's going to hell. And it particularly bothers me because last year, when this came up in a really important context, when Rogan endorsed Bernie just before the Iowa caucus, there was all this controversy about whether it's okay that Bernie had accepted the support of this terrible person. And, a lot of that was ginned up by bad faith actors and supporters of other candidates. But, I saw way too many people with that Democratic Socialist red rose emoji in their Twitter handles who are going along with that. And I think that does speak to some of the counterproductive moralism that I'm trying to push back against in the book.
Yeah, and I just wanted to bring it up again because it's sort of in the news because Joe Rogan went on his show and is now like doing vaccine skeptic stuff, and almost immediately you started to see people on Twitter being like, yeah, this is exactly why we tried to warn Bernie, and especially now they feel vindicated because he didn't win, like it wasn't enough to get him victory. Yeah, and like. I think, and I want to get into the culture stuff, like the culture of the left, maybe, which might be a problem of a term, but in a second. But I think that your emphasis here, because a lot of people, when they hear cancel culture, they immediately go into like a panic, like they know their response, right? There's the idiots like the Prager, Dennis Prager and Adam Carolla, they like there's a whole right-wing cottage industry about getting worked up about cancel culture, and then there's a whole like left-wing group that just immediately hears that and they like put their fingers in their ears and say it doesn't exist. And there's some reason for the confusion why so many people do different things with it, because it's this very slippery term. But and I know you touch on a lot of things, so I don't want to say your book is limited, but in this Joe Rogan example, right, we're talking about a question that a political movement is having in the midst of an important campaign about whether or not they should take an endorsement from somebody who's going to tell all their people that this is the way to go, right? This is the campaign to support, on the basis of, if we litigate this guy's entire like life and all of his political opinions and social opinions, is he good or bad, right? And then this might not be the best way to try to build mass politics, not because we're trying to be tolerant necessarily of like bigoted behavior or anything like that, but because it's a very absurd way to engage with people, right? That, you know, everybody, you go into conversation and there's this moment where we decide, okay, you're A-okay or you are out of here, right?
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I think that's just that's just right. And the thing that most disturbs me about it is that I think that it shows a kind of mission creep in what is left politics for, right? What's the point? Because if you think that the purpose of political engagement is to try to change the world, to try to alter material reality, then this is then like somebody like Rogan endorsing Bernie, that's an unambiguous good thing, because especially because I mean I would understand the objection if there'd been some sort of process of negotiation where like Bernie had to drop certain points from his platform in exchange for this.
So that's a good
Right.
point.
It was costless.
Yeah, it's costless. So in exchange for nothing, the most popular podcaster in the world with an enormous audience of people who it doesn't even go without saying that they're going to vote for Democrats necessarily, is supporting you in a crucial moment. And by the way, it was also proof of concept for one of the big things that Bernie was pushing, which is that he could get people to vote for him who wouldn't even necessarily be counted on to vote for any Democrat who was nominated. And this is an unambiguous good thing, because the whole point, like certainly, especially in the context of an election, I mean, that really simplifies things. Like the purpose of an election, of participation in election is to get more people to vote for you than for the other guy. So you win.
Yeah.
And it just seems to me that if you still object at that point, then you're doing something else. And I worry that the something else is more about a symbolic display of moral commitment, than trying to achieve a different kind of society. And I also think there is a really bad overlap, right? I mean, like whatever you want to call it, like the sort of cancel-y trends in the larger culture. I agree the phrase cancel culture is an imperfect, label for it, and especially in the last several months, the discourse about it has gotten like really, really stupid. But also, whatever you want to call it, there are certain trends towards mutual surveillance, hair-trigger denunciation, trying to get people fired, that are a big thing that I would argue is just kind of a disease of neoliberalism. It impacts the whole political spectrum. But I also worry that it has a particularly bad effect on what I care the most about, which is the left, because the left has been like wandering around in the desert in total exile from any kind of real power for so long that I think a lot of people have become accustomed to thinking of politics in that symbolic protest kind of way. And you put that together with the fact that for all of these larger reasons that we can talk about, having to do with the fact that we live in a neoliberal hellscape where people can get fired over nothing, with the fact that we live in a society where people are incredibly atomized, they often feel most connected to other people online, with the fact that the social media companies themselves, like we were talking about when I was on last time, really incentivize our worst behavior. You put that all together with the particular pathologies of the left, from the last several decades, and it becomes like a horrible mess. And I really worry that we end up acting in ways that are going to make most people whose material interests would align from our program not really want to have much to do with us.
Like we talked about with Kale a few weeks ago, or I can't remember exactly what it was. It might have been last week for all I remember. But like people aren't engaged in politics all that often. And if, the main engagement is like you're going to what's popular in culture and then presenting yourself as, like you said, a hall monitor, it's bad. Like the thing with Joe Rogan, I remember joking with Michael about how like it'd be one thing if Bernie made a deal saying you can be czar of high school sports. And then it'd be like, yes, Bernie, what the fuck are you doing with this? But literally they just used him saying something about them for propaganda value. And I would say like that engagement, Rogan apologized for his vaccine stuff. Like I would say almost like, and during that campaign, he still says stuff that is completely like risible, but I honestly think it probably had, like, him having that kind of spotlight in the context of a presidential campaign probably kept him a little bit more honest than he was generally. Maybe that's a bit too much to say, but I think the idea that it empowered the worst parts of Joe Rogan is just not true.
But yeah, no, I think that's like 100% right. And the Bernie example, I think, is really clear there too, where it's like we're not actually having conversations about structural shifts on the Bernie Sanders platform or campaign, or even like, and like Bernie's not giving anything up for this. He's just bringing more people in, and if you're trying to do mass politics, that should be the goal.
Yeah,
But
and I would also point out that, like, even if, and I actually think with in the Rogan case, a lot of this is a little exaggerated, but even when you're talking about people who do have like really bad views, I guess the question I would raise is, what's the strategy for trying to get them to evolve in a better direction that's more likely to succeed? Is it sort of denouncing them and having nothing to do with them, or is it trying to appeal to them on the issues they can be appealed to, work together with them in the common project, and hope that doing that, moves them, kind of as they go, which I would argue is the history of the American labor movement at its best.
Yeah. I would say, like, with regards to professional, like, racists, though, like, you're talking, like, the great clip we all love is Hitchens talking to the Metzgers, and him having to get his dad, like, that's because, like, I don't know if
just for people who aren't familiar with that, he like interviewed a neo-Nazi, and this neo-Nazi does, like, it's Christopher Hitchens versus this neo-Nazi, and the Nazi does so bad that Daddy calls in like to like help his boy out, because Chris Hitchens is just destroying him.
Yeah, and it's like, I think that kind of conflict is good, and I don't know, I want to talk about the Mark Fisher at Russell Brand stuff, but is there anything you guys want to say before we get to that?
For the record, I don't think that the Metzgers can be part of any sort of socialist coalition.
I would not mean to imply that you did.
Well, I wanted to ask, though, before we got to the Fisher stuff, and this might sort of blend in well, because it's this book, once you announce the title, like, there was immediate, like, people immediately freaked out before reading the book. And I don't, like, for people who want to read about Ben's thoughts on comedy and cancel culture, there's a lot of it in there, but he's also really hitting at problems within the left and the left movement too. It's a very encompassing book of a lot of tendencies that I think, at least is my interpretation of the book, it's like really show their like worst aspects in what we're calling cancel culture, of this kind of like online activity. But there are a lot of kind of deficiencies with strategy and how people think about politics and things like that. But anyways, that put that all aside for a second. I wanted to pose this challenge to you, Ben.
Yeah.
And I won't do devil's advocate, but there are folks out there who, when they hear like a criticism of cancel culture, what they feel is this is saying that, like, oh, we should give everybody pass to, espouse really transphobic beliefs, espouse racist beliefs, and we shouldn't engage with them or anything like that. And, just let it be because it makes us look bad and it's not cool or whatever. Right.
Yeah.
Which I know is not necessarily your position, but if you don't use the tactic of the online mob to criticize powerful people who say bad things, or who use their platform to, amplify certain voices, how is this a retreat from that kind of conversation of holding people accountable? Or are you talking about something different?
Yeah, I guess what I would really most question in all of that is what it means to hold powerful people accountable. Like, what would actually count as holding people accountable? Which I mean might sound pedantic, but I think it's an important distinction, because what I would like, right, would be something that I think would involve a lot of holding powerful people accountable. Like, I would like the left to take power, so then, like, there are, like, among other things, that long list of American officials would be like standing trial for war crimes, for example, right? I mean, like, that's something that I would like, that would definitely count as holding people accountable. Oftentimes, I think that in a way we sort of end up being satisfied by a very weird idea of holding people accountable, which is that, like, we just sort of have that cathartic satisfaction of yelling at them and whatever. I mean, there are people I'm certainly not going to object too hard to anybody yelling at, like if back in like a couple of years ago when there were all these Trump officials who were responsible for child separation, who were being like yelled at when they went to Mexican restaurants and stuff. I mean, I'm all for that. Like if you see the head of the Department of Homeland Security out at a restaurant, and you want to tell him to go fuck himself, like go nuts, like let's do that, but.
It's also not going to win socialism. I mean,
it's also not going to win socialism, right? And it's something that I worry about being. I worry about letting ourselves like get sucked into this kind of pseudo politics where we're really most concerned with giving vent to certain feelings or making certain kinds of symbolic statements rather than achieving anything concrete. And especially when because one thing that should be a key difference between leftism and liberalism is that we understand that the main problem with the society that we're living in is not that there are individual bad people who have bad thoughts in their heads. It's that structures and systems that exist are bad and need to be changed. And of course, I don't want to just vague that up, right? Like Matt was talking about earlier, before I came on about Democrats, but I think that, capitalism, imperialism, those structures. And the thing is, the easiest thing in the world for the other side to do when they're feeling threatened is just cut loose individual spokesmen, right? Say, oh, hey, you think this guy's problematic? No problem. Right. Like we've got 100 more, where he comes from.
Yeah. Milo's book being canceled didn't turn him into a martyr, but it also didn't change any of the ferocity of reaction that he was representing briefly.
Yeah. I would say real briefly on the Milo point, I think that's an interesting case because sometimes, because memories are very short, we like to tell ourselves that we somehow ended Milo's career, that the left did that like, oh, see, we deplatformed him until he didn't go away. It's like, no, Milo's career was built on attempts to deplatform him. It ended because he said something that offended his conservative backers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's true. And so, yeah, let's go on to Russell Brand's person that I want to talk about a little bit, because I think Mark Fisher's Vampire Castle essay is right on the money. The what is it? The anarchists, blanking it on, but I like that section a lot. Russell Brand's an interesting case because I do think it was absurd when people taking him to task for like not being right on enough back then. I also come down on the other side of a little bit with, I don't think like Russell Brand's serving anybody by having Candace Owens on for a third time. I don't think like we should make it a priority to cancel Candace Owens, but I think like we be honest about this. Or like we have to be honest about what Candace Owens is. And when you are taking her seriously, you're sending a certain kind of message I think is dishonest about some of these people. And like Dave Rubin's another one, right? Like a chunk of my career has been in defining Dave Rubin as something he was saying he wasn't, which is like a conservative, right? And
well, now he seems to have come around.
Right, exactly. Yeah, now he's embracing it. But so like where do you like speak to this tension a little bit? Because I think negative definition and like I like Hitchens' first book. I mentioned Hitchens a lot in this context, which maybe says something. But Letters to a Young Contrarian, where he says no light without heat. And I like that. I like mix it up a little bit. Like I'm curious. Yeah. Talk a little bit about that.
I like mixing it up a little bit, but I think that there are more, and I mean, look, I don't if whatever other bad things some people might might think about me since they saw the title of the book and lost their minds. At least I think one thing everybody does, I hope, know about me is that I really like fighting with conservatives. I mean,
right.
That's like 99.9% of what I do. So I like mixing it up. But I think that I think it's worth thinking about the more and less useful ways to do it, because and I mean, I don't think I mean, Russell Brand, like I think he's a mixed bag. I think that what exactly he's trying to accomplish with those Candace O interview, he might be making some weird decisions there, but like putting that aside, I think that if you are going like you're you're a student and your university invites, I don't know, Ben Shapiro or somebody to speak there, and if the way that you bring the heat is by circulating a petition for them not to invite him,
Yes,
and protesting, that he's been invited, and maybe protest in a somewhat disruptive way that's easy to play as they're trying to stop him from speaking, you've just handed a gift to Ben Shapiro. That's what he lives for. That's the best possible PR that he could give. Look, I'm so dangerous, right? That they can't even let me talk.
Forbidden knowledge is the selling point they have.
No, exactly. Forbidden knowledge is the whole thing. I mean, again, Milo, his he literally toured campuses. It was called the Dangerous. It was like, I don't remember what exactly the phrase was, but like dangerous was part of it.
F word after, the world's most dangerous. And that was the whole thing. Ben Shapiro's book, The Right Side of History. He has the back cover is all about how many cops they needed at the University of California, whatever the hell it was, to protect him from speeching. Brett Weinstein wouldn't have a career without what happened at Evergreen. We would never have to hear that guy's opinions ever. So that they love. Whereas the Dave Rubin example is perfect because when people, I mean, thanks in large part to you and you guys, when people if somebody is outside of a Dave Rubin event with a protest sign, there's a 98% chance that what that sign is going to say is debate Sam Cedar, which is actually a really effective. Right. That's a good posture to be seen on, a challenging one, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Because so that lets you have some heat, that lets you, protest. So it's you're not just sitting at home and ignoring it, but you're doing it in such a way that instead of making them look subversively dangerous and people can't handle them, it makes them look like they're afraid. That seems like a way better approach.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think in general, I think one of the bigger points of your book is making in our engagement with the right wing is that acting like they're untouchable or so dangerous to interact with makes them feel, seem way too strong.
It's not trusting of your fellow man when you do that. People can't make this decision for themselves. It is, I mean, I keep coming back to this.
Maybe their arguments are so convincing that if you hear them, then you're just going to turn into a big Ben Shapiro, which I'm telling y'all is the opposite. People who I've met in my life who are big, right wingers typically have only the left presented to them in this incredible, false narrative way that the Ben Shapiro presents it as, right? So it's to our disadvantage to let people like Ben Shapiro just sort of march around the globe and, and say, no, I don't want to hate me. Even though it must be said, there are plenty of people who are willing to engage with him and everyone's favorite boy, Jordan Peterson.
Yes, who actually, I mean, it's amazing because, a little bit of a diversion, but if I can do this for just a minute, the Peterson thing is particularly incredible to me because back in 2018, Jordan Peterson was going to be on my editor Doug Lane's podcasts, and he was scheduled. He was on the books. Then either Peterson himself or more likely somebody who works for him figured out who Doug was, that this wasn't going to be a friendly interview, and they canceled it.
Right.
Not 2 weeks later, Peterson was on the Joe Rogan show, and Rogan said, "Hey, these equality of outcome Marxists you're always talking about, why don't you ever debate one of them?" And he said, "Well, they don't want to talk to me," and which I'm glad all that happened, because I wouldn't know you guys if that series of events I just mentioned hadn't happened, because what that then led Doug to do in collaboration with some people in Idaho was to organize this conference, Move and Debate, which is where I met Michael and, et cetera. So the fact that was 3 years ago and still Peterson is pretending that publicly pretending that people don't want to debate him. 3 years after that, 2 years and change after he weaseled out of debating Richard Wolff, 2 years after he did debate Slavoj Žižek and it went very badly for him. So yeah, these guys will certainly lie about it. No question about it, right? I just think, and this is, but I think that maybe it's a very small point, but it's one that's worth taking a second on. That sometimes when you talk about stuff about how the left presents itself, optics, the image we project to the world, a way too easy way of kind of evading all those critiques is to say, well, whatever, it doesn't matter. They'll just spin whatever we do. They'll the corporate media, the right wing, whatever, they'll lie. They'll, so why are you even that concerned about that? And of course, there's a germ of truth to it that they totally will, right? But also that's just a counsel of defeat. That's just saying, oh, we're just going to give up on winning any sort of like victories in a rhetorical war with these people, and just completely ignore it. It's like, yes, they do have a lot of cards. They are very unscrupulous. They will lie and they will spin things, but also why on earth would you make it easier for them?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great point on that. And before we move on to some of these other little things that we want to talk about, because we have some fun stuff too that we wanted to get to while we have a friend Ben here, I did want to ask you, because I just get frustrated when I see this get rehashed, and I'm sure you probably get frustrated too, again, with everyone getting worked up about, the concept of cancel culture and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Let me just make my quick argument or pitch here on a point that I think is important, and might be because look, it's important. What you're saying is we want the left to be attractive to people, right? We want to bring people in, right?
Yeah.
But again, I just wanted to hit, to take a second stab at this. What some people get worked up about is they think that means rejecting, fighting for people, for example, trans rights, or making sure that people are identified and treated in a certain way that they deserve to be treated, right? And what some people think is a criticism of cancel culture, which again is a slippery thing that covers honestly too much. What they think this means is we're saying reject that, don't have those conversations, so we can be the cool kids who can just have the mass platform. Now, I'd be curious what you think about this, but I would just say, very briefly, the only way that these things change in society is building community, and organizations that are bringing people from different communities and different experiences together. To put it most concretely, you look at the studies of what happens in unions across the United States, where people who are working in multiracial unions tend to have less racist views, right? And that's because people are recognizing themselves as part of a common community, and we're working through those issues. That doesn't mean that every interaction that people have is perfect and that there aren't exceptions, but this is the kind of historical slog that is needed to create these kind of, more communitarian dreams that we have for society. The problem with a lot of the way that people are engaging with these fights now is walling things off. It's saying the left and the social struggle is this is for us, this is for the people who already know all the correct things, who already know all the correct positions. And if you don't come into it with these, you're not going to learn either, right? And I would say this, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so I'd be curious to hear your response to this. I would say that's the only way you're going to successfully build it right now, because what we've created on the left, especially the online left, the people who are familiar with these arguments and understand these concepts, is if we don't have a kind of outward looking perspective that is fixated on building mass politics and mass movements, we won't be successful both on the political arena of liberating people from the struggle of living under capitalism and all these other things, and we also won't be successful in these other avenues of life either, because the hope of our politics is that it's emancipatory, because we have the potential power as a working class to do it, but also by bringing people together, we can sort of cut through a lot of the BS that gets pumped into to us from the get-go, right? So for me, the argument about cancel culture is twofold. It's like, let's make this attractive so people come in. And then two, if you want to deal with these, issues in people's heads and the way that people think about the world, if you want to engage them, you have to have something that is inviting so people can have the space to learn.
Yeah, those were all words I'm pretty happy to have in my mouth. So yeah, I agree with 100% of all that. I guess just to expand on a couple of elements of it a little bit. I do agree that especially lately, I think the phrase cancel culture has, because it's been so totally absorbed into kind of day-to-day partisan nonsense, it's gotten really expanded. Like I feel like a year ago, God, not even a year ago, when we had like 6 years of discourse about the Harper's open letter, like at least back then, I felt like I knew what everyone meant when they used that phrase. Now it's gotten a little weird.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with the Harper's letter is like, I knew what everybody meant. They meant different things. Like I knew what Chomsky meant. I knew what Jeet here meant. I knew what Barry Weiss meant, and they were like slightly different. But yeah, I take your point.
Yeah. But like, I think that now that like there's all this stuff where, like oftentimes, of course, Republicans and conservatives are going to take any concept and mangle it, until it's unrecognizable. I mean, that's just the breaks. So, like instead of talking about what I always thought we were talking about, which is online, like kind of mob, pile-ons and hair-triggered denunciations and try to get people fired or deplatformed. Now we're talking about like 100 things. There's this like, like the Dr. Seuss, whatever that was, and all of that. And I don't care about most of those things, but I think that I do care about the sort of hair trigger denunciations and trying to go after people and get them fired or deplatformed. And I particularly care about it. Obviously, none of that stuff that I just mentioned is by any stretch of the imagination unique to the left. It happens, it happens on the right. Certainly, you can find people trying to like online campaigns to get some Starbucks barista fired, because she said F Trump, it happens all the time. Probably more than any other direction. It happens from like centrists, like they're
absolutely
the worst offenders. But I'm particularly concerned about the way that it interacts with the pathologies of the left and the way that it distorts the way that we act, because I want us to win. If the rest of those factions are toxic and unappealing, then great, I'm happy, right? But I don't want us to be toxic and unappealing. And I hear what Griscom is saying about the, like, okay, so you don't want this to get twisted up as trans rights are unimportant, gay rights are unimportant, countering misogyny is unimportant, because of course none of those things are true. Those things are all important. I would point out that I think there's a lot of mythology about socialists being class reductionists and stuff like that. I point out that historically, if you go back and look at the civil rights movement, or even earlier, like the rise of sort of mass industrial unions in the 30s, socialists and communists who were at the forefront of those fights were actually the people, really the only people almost in the United States who cared about civil rights back then. That if you look at Bernie as mayor of Burlington, he was talking about trans rights when almost nobody in the world was. I think that there are a couple reasons for that. One is that as socialists, we know that none of these issues actually do cleanly divide off from economics. If your boss can fire you for being gay or trans, that's an economic issue. If there are some countries are dominating, other countries and stopping them from being economically sovereign, that's certainly an economic issue. And we could say the same thing in numerous other cases. And the other thing, of course, is why would you be a socialist in the first place if you didn't have some basic egalitarian impulses? And I think all that's totally right. But again, the question I just relentlessly go back to is, what's a strategy that's going to work? And I really like what David said about that. I often think I'm, probably to an unhealthy extent, I always think of like every issue in terms of like movie references, but I always think of I think it's like from the 80s, James Earl Jones was in it. I remember Madawan. You guys see Madawan?
No.
Okay, you should watch Madawan. It's a great movie. It's like actually a shocking thing that this was made in the Hollywood studio system. It's about the coal wars in West Virginia in the 1920s. The main character is like a wobbly union organizer, and in that movie, it accurately depicts. So it's like a it's a very white redneck kind of mining town, and they've brought in some black workers to be scabs during the strike, but then I think James Earl Jones, is the character who's leading them, and they're willing to cross over and join the union. And then they have these union meetings where they're like, I don't know, do we really have to let black people in the union? I don't like that,
Mm-hmm.
And then like you even get like these things that are like more fine grained. There are people who like don't like the fact they're Italians in the union, and you get arguments about that. But I think what it does correctly show is that historically, one of the best ways of getting people to get over that stuff, and certainly a better strategy than anything else I've heard, is to be involved in some kind of common struggle where you're working together with people in ways that you see as serving all of your interests. And oftentimes, just the fact that you have that intense common experience can do more to humanize people in other identity categories than anything can. Certainly, it's going to do more to affect those kinds of changes and attitudes than sort of interpersonal shunning and excommunication, or I don't even know what the liberal answer is at this point, force everybody in the world to go to Robin DiAngelo trainings or something like that. I don't think any of that's going to work.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's what we were saying about anti-racism becoming not a demand for structural change, but a management project. And I think you touched on it a little bit, but one of where I am a bit unagreeable in this topic is, and you don't do this in your book. It's when you portray the censoriousness as a specific left pathology, because I think there is a massive effort to do that right now, to say like it's liberal backstabbing that's setting up for like any kind of coming purge. And like I just think, for the sense, like we're talking about Guatemala, the Jakarta method, just the mass killing based on ideology that it created the world we live in today. And that's really my main concern about this discussion. And I think
even in the United States, I mean, there's McCarthyism, and whatever. I mean, like memories are very, very short.
Well, and McCarthyism, they came off touting that they were going to go after both fascism and communism equally. And, which way did that go? So I think that is the ultimate, I guess, that is, I think, a very important lesson, I think, to remember in terms of the way this can go. Because I think McCarthyism was the state wanting to get a hold of the ideological apparatus that was Hollywood, basically, and the CEOs, to take it back from the workers that might be red. And I think like that's really the context for what we're talking about tech, I think, too. And I think you're right in stressing like the way the left should be seen in entering this fight, which is more
I'd also
democracy.
point out that we don't need to go as far back as McCarthyism. I mean, I'm a few years older than you guys. I can vividly remember, the Bush administration, which was a time when the culture was extremely censorious, from like a right-wing jingoistic perspective. I mean, that was the time people were like, burning, piles of, Dixie Chicks, albums and, and whatnot. That's so I think that. I think that right now there are certain kinds of censoriousness that have a sort of woke flavoring to them because of larger cultural changes. But I also think that if you're focused on that, then you're missing the boat on the larger thing that's going on. Because like that that changes, right? Like this is the fact that now like every Fortune 500 company, is going to like issue statements about, Black lives and possibly even structural racism. Although, as you point out, I'd be fascinated to hear what the structure is that they have in mind. But like, not that long ago, it was all these, like the, we saw corporate censorship, certainly of the anti-war movement, et cetera. And I think that as long as these kinds of corporate oligarchs are in charge, I mean, like which cultural norms they're enforcing might shift over time.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's not the main problem.
Well, it's not that is the thing. It's not trustworthy. Like, I mean, yeah, I don't know. Anyway, David, do you want to go on? I haven't formulated that thought.
Oh no, I mean, I was just thinking, I just downloaded State of Decay 2, which is like a zombie video game, and like the first thing that I met with is a banner that says Black Lives Matter, and I don't know anything about the company that developed the game, but it just felt very strange to be like loading up a zombie game and be hit with this protest that was, especially at its like outset, even in this past year in 2020, for a while was like feeling very subversive and very radical, and I still think it still has that potential and feeling for a lot of folks. But it is interesting how quickly, corporate America has been able to try to participate in that conversation. But, just so we don't get too distracted down that rabbit hole there, I do think it's worthwhile to talk about, so that's mass culture stuff, right? Its relation to the left, I think is important. What do I mean by that? The relation between us as individuals to politics, right? And it's a big problem for the left, particularly the socialist left. But I also think it actually cuts across all spectrums of like non-voters, people who want to consider themselves to be socialists, but working class people, is a belief that politics is like a way that you can express your feelings versus express your power as a class, right? That has to do with class de-alignment, things like this. Not to put too many things together at once, but I want to quote from Mark Fisher, who you quote in the book many times, about this question of purism, right? Because I think because you talk about this is a consequence of neoliberalism, right? I don't think that it's a mistake that we're seeing this across the spectrum in culture. But it's particularly a problem for the left, which if you're talking about anyone feeling powerless, if you consider yourself to be a left-wing person, you probably are feeling, as powerless as you can be politically. This is the Mark Fisher quote right here. Purism shades into fatalism. Better not to be in any way tainted by the corruption of the mainstream. Better to uselessly resist than to risk getting your hands dirty, right? Which that's from his piece on Exiting the Vampire Castle, but you sort of lock into your argument against the cancel culture sense of view of the world, right?
Yeah, and I think the two are linked because the same way that with what we were just talking about, which is the way that the post George Floyd unrest got to a disturbing extent, kind of diverted and channeled that energy into a lot of symbolic nonsense in many cases, sort of getting corporations to make certain gestures, getting I don't you no longer even live there. I can probably say this is I always I've used this example 100 times, but I always vague it up and say it's a friend of mine who's a podcaster who lives in Brooklyn. And then the joke I always make is that narrows it down to 5,000 people. But David Griscom is the source of the story. I think I could say at this point, especially because now he's not even in that, in Brooklyn anymore. But I remember you sent me those the screenshots from that local beer place in where you lived, where people were piling on the website of this like neighborhood beer garden because they hadn't issued a statement in support of the protest last summer. They also hadn't issued any other statement. They hadn't done anything.
Never. They would post a picture that said we have beer specials, right? Like that. And then everyone was getting worked up because they hadn't done anything on their Instagram account in solidarity and support of the protest, right? Which was wild to me.
Yeah,
knowing,
no, totally.
Not to go into this thing, but knowing, like, having worked at many bars in my life, and knowing that the people who do the Instagram typically are just some like guy you pay $200, you know, to give him and then he never shows up again, right?
Yeah, and the question to my mind is, why are people doing stuff like that? And I think that a big part of the reason, and this connects up with what you're raising now, you know, is that changing the way that policing works in America is an incredibly heavy political lift. I mean, that's amazingly difficult. Like, things are so bad that like we were all amazed, you know, whenever it was a week or two ago, when somebody who was filmed committing murder that everybody saw, you know, was actually convicted. That was that was shocking, you know, that happened. So changing the way that those systems work is incredibly difficult. Harassing like some like neighborhood beer place into mumbling the right words is incredibly easy. So of course you're going to get diverted from the really hard thing to the really easy thing. And I think that there's a version of this that happens specifically on the left, and that ties into that Fisher quote that you just gave, where actually trying to win power, to win a primary, to win a strike, any of those things are really hard. I mean, they like we just saw. I mean, my God, right? I mean, the last year, we saw the Bernie campaign, crash and burn after an incredibly promising, beginning. We saw this organizing campaign in Bessemer that people had all these hopes, invested in, failing, and that is really difficult. And once you do get your hands dirty in those attempts to change the real world, I mean, you get your heart broken. Whereas if you can kind of retreat into this posture of sort of performative radicalism, that's a lot easier psychologically. And so I think that's one reason why we've seen a kind of like, especially on like the online left, since the Bernie campaign, especially since the election, with great difficulty, I'm going to resist the temptation of naming any names, but we've seen a real retreat into into a lot of performative ultra leftism, and like, oh no, I never should have supported that Bernie stuff anyway. That's bourgeois politics. That because it's easy, it's comforting, it's zero risk, and I think it's the same thing when people end up tearing each other apart over the tiniest of political differences. I mean, we had. I'm not going to derail anything into the specifics of this, but I mean, a few months ago, we had people like issuing bulls of excommunication at each other over a disagreement about a parliamentary tactic.
That's what I was thinking about with that Mark Fisher section too.
And I don't want to like relitigate it too much, or more of what I'm saying is like, I just don't want to spend too much time on it. But I actually do think that's worth bringing up. That point is worth bringing up, right? Because it's a lot easier to sit here, like let's not, like, first of all, like when it comes to the tactic, right? I'm all about it. I think that AOC should be doing a hell of a lot more. I think they all could be doing a hell of a lot more. Maybe I'm just pessimistic in my analysis of it and saying like, I don't find those folks to necessarily be representatives of like the socialist movement. I think they are outgrowths of what we've been able to do, that we have people who are fairly sympathetic, right? But I don't see them as like party members, for example.
Yeah,
right. Anyways, this is I don't want to get into like the tactics, right?
No.
What was frustrating about that moment, right, was that like there wasn't a belief of its victory, but of its expression, right? And this goes back to what we were saying earlier, where politics can be an expression of your like frustration and anger, which we all like very much feel. The reason we were getting, or I'll just speak for myself, the reason I was getting frustrated with it was not because I think AOC and the squad or whatever beyond criticism or anything like that. It was me saying, like, even if you get what you want, it's like, oh, it's like Lacan, right? It's like, you know, like you don't know what you want, right? Like if you get what you think that you want, you're going to be disappointed. And the point is that, you know, to win, we have to recognize the situation that we're in, that we don't have the working class organizations that we need to be able to implement, hell, even social democratic politics in this country right now. And to get there is going to take a hell of a lot of work. It can happen, but it's going to take a hell of a lot of work. And to just think that, like, you know, what we need to be doing is expressing ourselves versus like building these movements, I think is a mistake. And that was the thing to me, is like, is a fantasy though that comes out of like a despair, right? Out of like, we're actually like, we can't really do anything. Maybe we could create a, you know, sense of spectacle to get some kind of satisfaction.
Right. Go ahead. You want to respond, Ben?
No, I think that's right, you know, and I did like, and in that case, again, I mean, I think that the tactic, you know, it itself, I mean, like I was obviously happy to, you know, to have that argument.
Well, yeah, can we just clarify it a little bit? Like there's a couple tactics, right? Like the thing that I think pretty much everybody on the left agreed with, which is that that AOC and squad can use some sort of leverage for something. And then it got redirected into the only thing they can use it for is to force this vote, which will, and this was all done in the course of like, it's a pandemic, with that moral blackmail, I would call it. Meanwhile, the result of it would be going down, and then basically the material reward for that entire thing would be primary material in a couple of years. Like, I mean, it was ridiculous.
At best, but beyond that, it's mainly it's like to have psychic targets to be able to come out.
Exactly.
I love that, you're right, but I mean, they're all targets.
No, exactly. So look, I don't want to derail this to you know to relitigating something that I'm probably going to continue having nightmares about, you know, in 40 years. But people want to know what I thought about the thing itself. I wrote an article in Jack, you know, at the time. You can check that out. But what concerns me in this context is not so much good tactic, bad tactic, okay tactic, as the fact that a argument over a proposed like one-day parliamentary maneuver was treated as if people were like fighting on opposite sides of like the Russian Civil War or something, you know, that like that it was this like, oh my God, you know, we have to like excommunicate everybody who's you know who has the wrong take on this like proposed parliamentary tactic that won't happen anyway, but like, you know, if it did, blah blah blah, right? Like that to me indicates that something is going on other than an earnest attempt to change the world. And like, and I should say, like, tons of people I respect disagreed with me about the particulars of the issue. You know, you counter-revolutionary, and I think that's like a really bad sign of the kind of psychic space that people were entering into at that point. I think there have been a lot of bad signs like that because, you know, we had this moment in, you know, it was a long moment, but basically 2015 to 2020, you know, the two Bernie campaigns, when it kind of seemed like the door of political possibility was opening for us. Not like, you know, I mean, in a very small way. I mean, we're ultimately talking about social democratic electoralism, and you know, and even there is very limited. But it was, but it's something like it was incredibly excited after what like the last, you know, several decades, you know, we're like for the left. And now we're in this moment where that started to close again and or at the very least become much more complicated, right? Like it's much less clear, you know, where there's a path forward. And I think a lot of people are freaking out about it, and it's really bringing out some of the worst tendencies of the left. And I mean, I will say, look, I mean, I started writing this book at the end of 2019, and you know, and I was writing it in, you know, like spring of 2020, and there were moments that spring where I actually had thoughts like, oh man, this book's not going to come out until 2021. when this comes out, it's entirely possible Bernie Sanders is going to be president, because Bernie's president, that like DSA will be like have like 1 million people in it. It'll have like had another like crazy proportional growth spurt. There are going to be tons of things going on in real world activism, because of that. A book about how the left gets bogged down in counterproductive moralism and gets in its own way is just going to seem weirdly irrelevant in this moment. So what am I doing spending my time on this? And man, I did not need to worry about that.
Yeah, I'd say not.
No, I think that's on. Well, we definitely had some other things we wanted to get to, but I feel like we've covered so much with this book, which is a testament about how much people need to be spending time with this book, because it brings up so many important questions for us. I wanted to read a quick line from it before we disappear, because I think it's good, where Ben says, when politics becomes a moral performance, the question of whether or not you're actually advancing your stated goals recedes into the background. And we should be focusing on those goals. Those should be right on the horizon for all of us. And if everybody spends some time reading this book, maybe it'll be a little bit closer. Thanks so much, Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. All right.
That was fun. I always feel bad. We could have gone for another hour, I feel like, on that one.
I mean, there's so much to get into with this topic, because it is, it's our moment right now. And it's something that really, it does. I think that's why we didn't even talk about, I think, the part where Burgis quotes Ralph Leonard about how, I'll say just for my part, I think Dave Chappelle handles these things fairly decent. I mean, I don't buy, whatever. Mm-hmm. Bill Burr completely just it a meltdown, and it was hard to watch about cancel culture, and I think just that message that says to a Bill Burr fan, I just think it's bad. And I don't want to blame the left for Bill Burr sucking in that moment, but I think it is just comedians are talking about this a lot, and I take that as somewhat, because they do. There are in a lot of different parts of the country, and they typically know better than politicians what normal people are saying. Mm-hmm. And I just think it's dangerous to, get caught managing in those sorts of situations, because I think people really, they're very tied to their cultural touchstones. And if all of a sudden you're going to tell them that they can't enjoy X or Y and that's your political emphasis, I think it's nonsensical.
Yeah. And I mean, there's a lot of, I think that's on point. I think that, really comes out of the fact that when we talk about the left and the socialist movement in this country, there's a bunch of different things that we're talking about. One is the organic development of working class consciousness. And two is a lot of people who are very active and are trying to push that movement to happen. Right. And I'm not one of these people who thinks it's worthwhile being this, just because you're a socialist and you're active means you're somehow not a part of the working class. I think that's such a defeatist mentality. But there is a culture, especially, Matt and I are around the same age, and we socialize in similar circles for the most part. Right. And there are cultures that are sort of dominant. Now, what I mean by it is these are the things that people listen to, the shows that they watch, things like that has a lot of sway over left culture, because it is a youth movement, as almost every socialist future facing movement has ever been. But I also think that we have to sometimes wrestle with some of the pathologies that comes with, where it's youth and energy is good, right? But we all have our kind of blind spots or things that we get hyper fixated on. Just for example, the non-institutional fixation of the new left in the US in the 60s, we're learning now was a huge mistake, right? It really set back socialist organizing, a refusal to deal with, class, really, to figure that we're going to come up with a new kind of, that's why they call it the new left, right? A new way of doing, Marxist politics without focusing on the working class, right? That was a disaster, right? A lot of the anti-war stuff, environmental stuff, free love, anti-racism stuff, all that stuff, that was good. I don't know. I'm just saying we also have to be able to be self-critical of ourselves as a generation. And I hope that's not too particular, but I know a lot of our audiences, around our age too, we should, not in a conservative way, but as people who are trying to build a better world, be a little bit, look at ourselves for a little bit and say, it's like, are we doing these things to build a class movement that can win power? Are we doing these things to continue a kind of cultural hegemony movement that I'm a part of with my cohorts or my people who are my age?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know why this came into my head, but I was just reminded of the rally to restore sanity for some reason. So I think I'm like
no, but it's like if they're supposed to be, what are they? What, Gen Xers above us? Sort of like have to deal with what that politics was. Like millennials, we have to deal with what our politics are too, and like how our cultural stuff sort of blends into that too. But for a lot more hot takes and fun stuff and hanging out, join us for the post game at patreon.com/leftreckoning. And this Sunday, this conversation with Walter Rodney, I'm really looking forward to it. Well, Matt's running around barefoot through that's going on WikiFeet, bro.
Really great book. I read this last August, and I'm very excited to talk to Milton about Rodney.
And also, too, not to just be too self-promoting, please consider subscribing to the YouTube channel. We're pretty close to getting 10,000 too. That'd be nice to hit.
Be nice. Yeah.
I'd really appreciate that as well if you haven't already. All right, y'all. We'll see patrons in a little bit. And
patrons, look around 10 p.m. Eastern time. We'll be there with post game.
Sounds good. And then see everyone else on Tuesday for Griscom Stream.
Peace out.